Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to thank you all for joining us today. And because I know there's quite a number of people who registered for this webinar, we're going to wait a couple minutes before we start. So thank you very much and enjoy the quiet for now. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to just give it a couple more minutes. All right. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. It's 2:03 by my clock, and I know we have a pretty loaded agenda, and I want to make the best use of everyone's time. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Christina Wong. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for Northwest Harvest, and I'm joined today by members of our Community Response Action Team, which is part of Washington State's Food Security Coordination Team, including Sharon Navas from the Equity and Education Coalition, who is very kind in hosting us today, as well as Carolyn Connor from Nutrition First, Bianca Smith from OSPI, Andrea Coletto from Twin Transit, and others. So thank you so much for joining us. And we're going to go ahead and get started with our presentation. This will let me, there we go. I just wanted to kind of go over what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to start with some background information about the Food Security Coordination Team and why we thought that it would be a good idea to develop a model team structure for doing a local coordinated response to hunger during COVID-19. So we'll talk a little bit about the purpose and goals behind that coordinated response and a model coordination team structure. We'll then have a panel to give some examples about this kind of coordination work that's happening in real time. And our panelists include Andrea Coletto from Twin Transit, who will be talking about the Lewis County Seniors Coalition, State Representative Marcus Riccelli, who will be talking about the Spokane Food Fighters, and David De La Fuente from Communities and Schools in Kent to talk about the work he's been doing with the South King County Food Fighters, with a local coordination group in Kent, and how that's building up to a regional model for South King County. So lots of different examples for people to hear about today. Some of you might have heard about this effort through a survey that we sent out last month. That was an attempt to gather some information about what kind of coordination efforts are already happening on the ground. And so we want to share a little bit of information from those surveys, especially because they give some concrete ideas about what are some timely and topical issues around which we can do this kind of coordination work. We'll then break you out virtually into breakout rooms to do some small group discussion about what you've learned today so far during the webinar, and to help us with some valuable input about what additional resources and information might be needed. And then we're going to regroup briefly just to share out some of the things that were discussed in the small groups and talk about how we're going to follow up. I also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sending out the recording of this webinar, as well as staying in touch with additional follow-up materials. One of those follow-up materials, and I'll reiterate this at the end of the presentation, is that we would like to share the participant list from this webinar, so that way you, if you're interested in starting your own local coordination team model, you can get a sense about who else was on this call today that is from your community or area, and reach out to them. And we'll have an opt-out option for that as well, which we'll talk about at the end of this presentation. But just want to make sure I reiterate that a couple times so that people hear it. So moving into some background information. This is stemming from the Food Security Coordination Team for Washington State. If you haven't heard about the Food Security Coordination Team, this was convened and appointed by Governor Inslee back in March with the purpose of mitigating food insecurity during the pandemic. Really, the scope of work of the coordination team is to assess what the need is as far as food insecurity is concerned, and then coordinate what are the available public and private resources with an eye towards prevention. And what I mean by that is we're trying to take stock of what are the public resources that are that respond to food insecurity, things like SNAP or basic food, child nutrition programs like school meals, summer meals, the newly established pandemic EBT program, WIC clinics, senior meals, and then what resources are available from the private sector. So that comes primarily from our food banking system. Some the member agencies involved in the Food Security and Coordination Team include state agencies, the 4 state agencies that administer those public programs. So that's OSPI, DSHS, the Department of Health, and the State Department of Agriculture. State Senator Judy Warnick and State Representative Mia Gregerson are also part of the Food Security Nation team, linking that work to our state's food policy forum. We also have staff members from the governor's office, both his budget side and the policy side, in that important work of assessing what are the available resources. And then the 3 primary hunger relief non-government organizations, NGOs in our state, which include Northwest Harvest, and then the 2 Feeding America affiliates, Food Lifeline and Second Harvest. So as I said, the work of the Food Security Coordination Team, part of the work is to do a statewide needs assessment, looking county by county about what is the growing food insecurity that we're seeing throughout our state. We wanted to establish local coordination efforts, one, to make sure that when communities identify gaps in food service, when we know that there are people in our community who are going hungry, who can't make it to their local food bank, or who aren't able to get out to their grocery store and using their SNAP benefits, for instance, we want to make sure that when those needs are identified, that there's a fast and nimble response to it to help address that gap in service. We also want to make sure that when we identify those gaps in services, we want to make the most use of those sustainably funded resources. Those things like your SNAP benefits, WIC benefits, school meals, summer meals, and senior meals services. What I mean by that is, if it's a matter of people are eligible but not enrolling those programs, we want to be able to talk through what are the barriers to enrolling in those programs. And for those people who are enrolled in those programs, if it's a matter of they're not able to actually use their benefits, if there's some logistical barrier that's in their way, we want to bring together different organizations, both from the private sector and the public sector, who can think through those logistical issues and help improve the system, help improve access so that people can actually use those benefits that they're enrolled in. We also want to make sure that that this needs assessment work that the state is doing, that it's informed by the voice of community with a strong equity lens. In order to help line up the right resources and make the best cases for equitable distribution of our resources to help meet food insecurity. And we also think that if there's local coordinating groups that are working across the state and helping to give information to the state's food security coordination team, that this is an opportunity to share best practices from community to community and really help make the case for adding more resources that can help us in our response to hunger during this time. So those are the purposes and goals of a local coordinating structure. And what I want to turn my attention to now is to talk about, in order to meet those intended goals, we have our action team with the help and input from actually a number of you who are on this call, who met back with us back in April, gave us feedback about what a model local coordinating structure should look like. And we think that a model team structure should have organizations from 4 different categories of organizations. The first is a fiscal body, and that can consist of community foundations, your local United Way agency, and especially your local emergency operations center. And what I mean by the fiscal component about it is that these are organizations that can help identify funding and other resources like PPE, sanitation supplies, and volunteers to help carry out the coordination work. A model team structure should, of course, also have representation from food resources. And because the goal is to help make sure that people are connected with and actually able to use those sustainably funded resources, we want to make sure that, that the food resources organizations that are at the table include representation from those different programs. So representations from local schools, WIC clinics, senior centers or senior meal programs, food banks, faith-based organizations that are doing meal services, and if possible, also the food distributors, the three NGOs from the state, who are part of the food security coordination team. So Northwest Harvest, Food Lifeline, or Second Harvest, depending on who is the lead distributor for your community. Then a third component should be logistics. And this is when we are talking about what resources might be needed and in place in order to help problem solve what are the barriers or challenges to using, using resources that are creating these gaps in services in our system. So this can include your local transit authority, restaurant and retail sector, private companies that work on transportation and warehouse capacity.